joining us today for this next Centre for Policy Studies webinar. My name's Nick King. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and I'll be chairing our session today, which is entitled Roadmap to Recovery, Creating the Right Conditions for Small Businesses to Rebuild. We're particularly grateful to Xero for their support for this webinar, and we're lucky enough to have Gary Turner, Xero's co-founder and their managing director, with us today. He's just one member of the all-star cast that we have on our panel, each of whom I'll be asking to make some opening remarks to kick off this session. In the second half of the hour we've got together, I'm going to be coming to the audience for questions. So I'd ask anyone with a question for our panel to put it in the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen in front of you. And we'll do as best we can to get through as many of those questions as possible. Equally, if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to use Twitter and the @CPS Think Tank to put any question you might have to the panel. Before I come on to our first speaker, who's the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Glen, I'd just like to set the scene a little bit in terms of the small business landscape as we see it. Now, small businesses are obviously not alone in having had a very tough 12 months. The COVID-19 pandemic and then the restrictions put in place by the government have made life very difficult for individuals and businesses alike. But many small businesses have been particularly badly affected. The support package that's been put in place by government has undoubtedly been hugely generous and very effective. The furlough scheme, business rate relief, VAT discounts, bounce back loans, these have all helped to keep a huge number of our small businesses on life support. Indeed, the business death statistics for 2020 show that there were actually fewer business deaths and fewer businesses going out of business last year than there were in a typical year, which is pretty extraordinary given the year we've had. But for all that, the outlook for SMEs in this country is not great. Business confidence is down, and many SMEs have already made or expect to make redundancies in the coming months. Brexit has obviously made life harder, at least in the short term, for exporting businesses. And there are rumours swirling around of tax rises on the horizon, rumours that I'm sure the Economic Secretary will be more than happy to comment on later on in this session. And all of this comes on top of the fact that SMEs are often the forgotten child of UK policy making in any case. As we pointed out in our flagship report on this topic, Think Small, the UK basically operates a one-size-fits-all system, where SMEs and micro businesses in particular have to abide by many of the same rules and regulations as businesses many hundreds of times their size. As the polling we conducted as part of that Think Small report showed, lots of the men and women who run those businesses find that deeply frustrating, and as a result feel like government is on their side. 3/4 of those we polled said that the tax system was too complicated for small businesses, and more than 3/5 said that they didn't think that the government understood their needs. But for all that, these small businesses are remarkably resilient. Lots of them have found new ways of working or pivoted during their pandemic and changed their business model. More to the point, if we're to recover from this pandemic and get our economy back on its feet, it's these sorts of businesses who are going to have to do the heavy lifting. And that brings us back to our topic today, creating the conditions for small businesses to rebuild. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist for his views on this topic, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Glen. John was first elected in 2010 and has been Economic Secretary and City Minister for more than 3 years now. Very much the steady hand at the Treasury, given he's now on to his third Chancellor. He's a former director of the Conservative Research Department. He's a great policy brain and a good friend to the CPS. John, very grateful for your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, and it's great to join you for this very important webinar. It's really good for us to focus at this time, as we are unfortunately still in this lockdown situation, on what it takes to get back into a buoyant economic environment where small businesses that represent 99% of businesses in this country can thrive. And you've rightly set out the number of interventions that the government have made over the last 12 months to support small businesses, and I won't rehearse them all, but I've been involved in some of them personally in terms of the bounce back loans, which was, I think, a great success to actually get money into the hands of business owners immediately to give them some immediate support. But one of the things I wanted to sort of make the point up front is that we use that expression SME very liberally. But actually, of course, it's very, very sector specific, the different conditions that businesses have found themselves in. And what I see is a very complex situation with some businesses that, if they've been based in software technology, and last year we attracted $15 billion, 11.2 billion pounds worth of investment in the fintech sector, they will be doing well. But obviously there are other sectors that are in extraordinary pain and facing challenging circumstances, particularly in the hospitality sector, and those tourism and those related to it. So as we approach the budget, and I'm sorry, Nick, to disappoint you, I won't be revealing any details of the budget because they're in the mind of the Chancellor, and I'm sure some of those decisions he will be making. I support him as the City Minister, and I'm responsible for taxes on savings and pensions. But what I think is really important is that we acknowledge the starting point, which is that there's been 45 billion pounds worth of bounce back loans, and you rightly said that the business failure rate last year was lower than normal. I think it was about 25% lower than normal. So we've got a situation where we've got businesses that in other circumstances, we're not sure what status they would have had, because the support that we've given them has obviously helped them survive, and we wanted to support as many businesses as possible. But what we need to do is actually create the conditions where businesses can have support with working capital so that they can actually grow forward. And it's that balance between carrying the level of debt, and we've extended the payment terms for pay-as-you-grow to 10 years and given the opportunity for payment holidays from the bounce-back loans, which won't start until May, June. But what we're also aware of is that obviously if businesses are going to be able to hire new people, we need to make new interventions. And I'm expecting the Chancellor to be very keen to do everything he can in the budget in a few weeks' time to support businesses, to support the maintenance and creation of jobs. But that leads us to then the application of technology. And what's really important is that at these key moments of transition from where we are at the moment, that businesses and SMEs look to how they can do things differently, more efficiently, using the application of technology. And fintechs, we are world leading, and that's why we've commissioned a review which will imminently publish some recommendations on how we can support that sector, which then supports lots of small businesses. So I'm very aware as a constituency MP of the challenges that SMEs face at this time, but I'm also really focused in the Treasury on advising and working with my colleagues on a set of interventions that will allow that return to normal. And we promised a new support scheme for bank lending. So we're looking at that very closely, and announcements in due course. But what's really clear is that we must support SMEs. We've got to be sensitive to the range of experiences across different sectors, but recognise that a sustained recovery is going to be based on them getting back to normal, and in fact growing through innovation at these challenging times. And that is what we need to do over the coming months once the restrictions are lifted in line with the advice that we receive. I'll leave it there as a sort of opening gambit. I hope that's appropriate, and then obviously I'm happy to participate, take questions in due course.
That's brilliant. Thank you, John. Particularly interested in your point about the different conditions in different sectors, and therefore obviously any response needs to be sort of tailored according to that, because the blanket support doesn't really work in a very disparate organisation. Next up, we've got Gary Turner, who's the co-founder and the managing director of Xero. As I said, we're very grateful to Xero for supporting this webinar, and to Gary in particular for giving us his time. Gary's a small business software and tech specialist, and has been with Xero since its launch in 2009. And throughout that period, he has helped turn Xero from a 3-person company with a £50,000 a year turnover to a company employing thousands of people all around the world, with a turnover last year of over £100 million. So there aren't many people better placed to talk to us about roadmaps. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to the CPS for pulling this discussion together. I think this is a really important time. And I guess the decisions that we make and the pathway that we take in the next weeks will have profound implications for the months ahead. I want to bring a bit of framing to the discussion from our perspective. Now, we're here to talk about how small businesses can help lead the economic recovery that we need, and what are we doing, and what is the role of technology play in that, and also as an advocate for small firms, because all of our customers are small, what we believe. Before getting into the detail, though, I do want to explain why this is something that we really care about. In the UK, over 600,000 small businesses use our platform to manage their finances every day, either directly or with the help of an accountant. And to put that into some sense of scale, I mean, on a daily basis, we're handling transactions for our customers in the UK in excess of £1.5 billion per day, which is around 22% of our GDP. And what's possibly even more interesting is 1 in 5 VAT returns in the UK now come from somebody using Xero. So in short, we're seeing firsthand what's happening to the small business community and the impact the pandemic has had on our economy and jobs. And we believe that small firms really hold the key to job growth, but there are significant challenges that we must overcome. There are 5.9 million small businesses in the UK, and we believe they will create more new jobs than their larger peers, but they need the right environment in which to do that, and one that will support them thriving and growing. Xero Small Business Insights, which is our data barometer on the health of the small business economy through the lens of our large customer base, shows that revenues were down year on year 10% in December. And the index also showed that jobs remain around 4% down on pre-pandemic levels. So as job losses are lagging behind sales, then the underlying implications are quite grave. This suggests that when furlough support does eventually end, many jobs may not be sustainable. And that's why we've updated our roadmap to recovery, looking at how we help those small firms kickstart the economy and jobs growth. And there are 4 key areas that I want to share before we open up for discussion. First is we must accelerate digital adoption. And it's good to hear John touching on the role that technology must play in the fight back. We need to help small firms make the best use of the right technology and to be ready for any future disruptions, and also the change in customer habits and preference. Many have had to accelerate their adoption of digital tools, but others have not. Some governments have introduced grants and incentives to encourage tech adoption among small businesses, and to ensure that the UK small business economy isn't left behind. We'd like to see the government increasing R&D tax credits and review the definition to also include digital tools. We think that the remit of the Small Business Commissioner, which is actually making a significant impact already, but we think could do more to accelerate small firms in their adoption of technology and transform their business models and really make them future-proof. The second point is that we think that it's time for what we're calling a fair buyer's bill. When small businesses need the cash flow from their invoices to kickstart this new economy we need to build, we need to put an end to unfair payment practices. Our research also showed that during the pandemic, nearly 60% of small business owners said that their larger customers increased their payment terms and cut their fees. And it really feels like a one-way street sometimes when it comes to large businesses. And voluntary systems which are in place and are well-intentioned and do have some effect, but they don't always work because late payers simply don't join them. So we'd like to see the government introduce what we're calling a fair buyer's bill to really resolve that, prevent buyers extending terms, set 30 days not as an ambition and not as a benchmark, but the standard payment terms for all businesses, large or small, and really force and ensure that big businesses pay on time. The third point before I finish is really promoting the role of accountants and business advisors and coaches is, we think, vital. For many small businesses, their accountants have been the key workers of the pandemic. What they see and what they're doing with other firms who are facing into the challenges and how they deal with it. So many are reliant upon the help of their public practice accountants and bookkeepers and external advisors. And we think they're best placed to advise small businesses to make the right decisions coming out of the pandemic. Many, we think, can help small businesses navigate the EU transition. And as the UK exists in a post-Brexit reality, the changing VAT arrangements and some of the rules that have changed, we see again accountants playing an important part, helping and guiding small businesses. And so we'd like to see the government really run what we think should be a national campaign to promote the well-being of small businesses when they connect with a great accountant who understands the financials, is fluent, and can help them make the right decisions to invest in their business and drive the economic growth. And then finally, I'll close by saying that we must also work to increase the representation and the voice of small business in government. I mean, recently the government has set up a number of business advisory groups to help shape government policy, but they tend to be dominated by large firms. And given the urgency and given the role and the impact that small businesses could have in the recovery, we think that there needs to be a greater voice and a greater representation of small business in government. We think there's currently a bit of an imbalance with large businesses being not only overrepresented, but having the likes of the Federation of Small Businesses often as a lone voice at the table doesn't tick the box because small firms make up the majority of our economy. And so we think that the small business economy must have a greater voice to argue for the measures that will drive job growth and economic recovery. And therefore our ask of government there would be have more small firms engage in government, and that those that do and hopefully can participate in some of the Build Back Better councils and better regulation committee as a starting point would be a great place. And so these changes will not only help the millions of small firms across the UK, but it would overall boost employment and restore growth to the whole economy. And so I'd love to get into some of those topics this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thanks, Gary. Loads of food for thought there. Particularly struck by your final point about small business representation. And I did some time in the Department for Business and will be the first to admit that we were really bad actually at engaging with small businesses and getting into the issues from a small business perspective. And it's much harder than it is for big businesses because they don't have the lobbying presence and all the rest of it, but it's not really an excuse. And I think everybody needs to work harder at it. We certainly should have done. Our third speaker today is Eliza Easton. She's the head of the policy unit at Nesta and is a specialist on creative industries in particular. Nesta, as I'm sure lots of people listening in know, is an innovation foundation and typically brings research, data and science to its policy work. But there is much about the doing as they are the thinking. So to tell us more about what we might do on this topic, over to you, Eliza.
Thanks so much. So as Nick mentioned, I'm going to address this question by focusing on one specific part of the economy, the creative industries. That's partly because as part of my role at Nesta, I'm also head of policy for the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. So I think a lot about film, fashion, art, advertising, video games, design and more. Many people listening in probably already know what a crucial part of the economy these industries are, generating about £116 billion per annum in GVA, employing over 2 million people, or at least they were prior to the pandemic, and having huge soft power implications. But what you might not know is that the average size of a creative industries business across all of those subsectors is just 3 people, and around a third of the sector is self-employed. And my belief is that this isn't actually accidental, that a sector that's defined by producing unique creative outputs actually benefits from both self-employed people and smaller teams who bring specific abilities to any given project. So for example, say you're thinking about a film, you're going to need, depending on the film, the different types of special effects, you'll need different actors and even different production staff. It's clear that the sector faces significant challenges at the moment, and in the 6 months following the beginning of lockdown, our research has shown a collapse in working hours across the sector and significant numbers of people leaving the creative industries. And those new conditions only exacerbate pre-existing challenges, including some that Gary has already mentioned, relating to business size, late payments, and skills shortages. But I do think that this coming year, and particularly the budget and spending review, give the government an opportunity to stimulate growth in a world-leading sector, which actually already outstrips the GVA of life sciences, automotive and aerospace combined, but which has suffered in this pandemic. And so in my 5 minutes, I'm going to highlight 3 ways I think the government can support growth in the smallest businesses in the creative industries in the budget. I'm not going to touch for the moment on questions of trade or immigration. I'm also not going to spend too much time on skills policy because I could do another 5 minutes on that, but happy to talk about those in the Q&A. So the first is, it might be obvious given that I come from Nesta, I would advocate for an innovation-led recovery. And in terms of what that means, I think one thing worth raising is that the current definition of R&D that's used by HM Revenue and Customs for the purpose of tax relief actually excludes much of the work the creative industries do. I would say it focuses on widget development rather than on content development. And actually, in terms of how we apply the definition, it puts us behind countries like France, Italy, Denmark, Czech Republic, Brazil, Korea. As a really basic step, we need to be defining R&D in a way which works for the smallest businesses, particularly when those are the businesses that often find it hardest to get around the policy round the policy tables. We need to take the initiative in actually opening up a definitional review in terms of how we're applying tax incentives. And the recent spending review, which announced the investment of over 15 billion in R&D, just makes that all the more critical. The second recommendation I have is quite specific. I think there's a real opportunity to invest in a UK centre for AI in the creative industries. So our research has demonstrated that the UK has strengths in both the creative industries and AI research. In fact, we're best in the world, excepting US and China in both of those areas. But there's a huge gap when it comes to seizing the opportunity at the nexus of those 2 areas. And I think it tells us a lot about the issues for smaller businesses and policy more generally. So whilst YouTube, Spotify and Amazon are using AI techniques and machine learning to recommend creative content, there are actually lots of unexplored frontiers which are going to have impacts for small creative businesses like generative adversarial networks, GANs, style transfer, and those can be used creatively in film, fashion, design, music and art, particularly by small businesses. But they need a singular gateway to actually get access to those new technologies. And so we've recommended a 5-year innovation centre that provides that front door for training and skill development, having an accelerator function and being a gateway to kind of the cutting edge of R&D. The final recommendation I'd make is very broad again, and that's around devising a UK-wide investment programme to rebuild the creative industries that actively supports the very smallest companies. And again, looking at some of our research over the last few years, we found, we actually looked back at the last financial crisis and we saw an accelerated trend towards concentration of UK businesses in London. As attention turns to recovery from COVID, we've got to prioritise investment across the country to stop that happening again. It's worth mentioning that in 2018, the 2 fastest growing UK regions for creative industries, and that growth is inevitably coming from small businesses, were the northwest of England and the West Midlands, and the GVA growth rates there were 7% per annum. So we've got to make sure that that sort of progress isn't lost. And I think we've already discussed a bit how policy interventions at both a national and a regional level often bring the biggest businesses round the table. LEP growth hubs, for example, we've heard haven't always worked for SMEs in the creative industries, despite we know their desire to scale up. We found that access to finance is actually the biggest thing separating the opportunity for small businesses and for small clusters and big businesses in largest clusters in the UK. So that's London and Manchester, particularly Edinburgh, Glasgow. So therefore, something I'm really focused on is making sure that it's absolutely part of the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, the Towns Fund, all this money that's going into spreading opportunity across the UK, that actually those things do address the needs of small businesses, and they are set out in a way that that funding is getting to the smallest businesses. It's not just picking the kind of easiest fruit from the tree. For example, we're hoping to see questions of infrastructure focusing on digital infrastructure, and questions of skills need to address those of small businesses and self-employed, as well as the biggest businesses who can interact with local policymakers the most. So those are a few ideas, but happy to answer any questions in Q&A and really looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Eliza. And you've touched on something there which I think is a really interesting area, which is both the sort of challenge and the opportunity of tying SMEs to that levelling up ambition, which we know is really important for the government. And there have been some pretty significant steps in that direction, but there's clearly a lot more to do. And I think SME policy has to be a big part of it. So thank you for that. Our final speaker is Claire Walker. Claire is the Co-Executive Director for Policy and Campaigns at the British Chamber of Commerce. Claire, along with her other Co-Exec Director, Hannah Essex, lead work on comms, campaigns, policy and public affairs on behalf of the entire Chamber network across the country. And therefore, there are a few better placed people to tell us what she's seeing and what's going on up and down the country. And Claire, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's absolutely great to be here. Yes, I'm Claire Walker. I'm Co-Exec Director at the British Chamber of Commerce, a role that I share with my work partner, Hannah Essex. So you might see her if you engage with us Wednesday to Friday. Delighted to be here. As many of you will know, Chambers of Commerce represent really large businesses, international businesses, small businesses and micro businesses. And as part of that, we've been at the forefront of supporting some of those small and medium-sized businesses throughout the pandemic. I think it's fair to say, and I saw some of this on the chat, COVID-19 has been a historic setback for businesses. It has been one of the most extraordinary experiences that I will ever go through, but for businesses up and down the country, it has been desperately difficult. Critical to what we're hearing that small and medium-sized businesses are experiencing. We run our quarterly economic survey, and that's something that's been going on for nearly 26 years. So it's a long period of time that we've been able to track core things like business confidence, cash flow, and those kind of core things that we know is what drives the economy forward. I'm going to read out some of these statistics, but in the quarter four, it showed the sharpest decline in history of the QES in 2020, with the key indicators in quarter four remaining substantially below pre-pandemic levels. So we know that that initial shock has not been recovered, and that's something that we experience. Cash flow is a key indicator for business health, and that continues to deteriorate for 43% of the firms that take part in this large and substantially wide survey. And unsurprisingly, there is sectoral differences. So for hotels, catering, hospitality, they've been the worst hit, with 77% of them seeing a worsening outlook. So what's the way forward? What's the way to rebuild the economy following these really difficult shocks that businesses are experiencing? Well, the first thing to say is we know that the government is going to set their exit strategy hopefully next Monday, and this will be a core test of business confidence. And it's fair to say, having spoken to chambers up and down the country this morning, expectations are really high as to what this will provide businesses in terms of a roadmap out of the current crisis. We really very much want the exit strategy to be based on 4 core pillars. First of all, a clear roadmap out. Secondly, to continue that fantastic work that we've seen around the vaccine rollout. Thirdly, to improve and see substantial changes to the way that track and trace has been operating. And finally, long-term financial support. Now, I'm aware I've got a Minister of the Crown on the call, and it would be worth saying that, you know, we have repeatedly called that the roadmap needs to be mapped alongside a programme of financial support. And actually this gap that we're going to have potentially of a week between the roadmap being published and the financial support being published in the budget is deeply unhelpful for small and medium-sized businesses that are desperate to know and to plot a way forward to reopening. So my plea would be, if there's anything we could do at this last moment to change the budget date, that would be a fantastic move forward for many of those businesses. And secondly, my plea is around this long-term support. I think one of the things that we've heard repeatedly is that businesses have been really shocked, not only by the pandemic, but about the stop-start nature of the pandemic. And that stop-start nature of the pandemic has almost been the most punishing thing. Some of the stories I've heard have been heartbreaking. Businesses that thought that they were set to reopen, buying things, making changes, buying new stock and product, making alterations potentially for Christmas or for other periods of reopening, and then literally in some cases having to pour those down the drain in the cases of the hospitality industry. So we're very clear that this lockdown needs to be the last lockdown, and we need a path forward that means that there won't be a stop and start. What we know around business support, though, is that some of those cliff edges have been really unhelpful, and we've got a number of those cliff edges coming up. And we would like to see a whole year of support going forward for the whole of 2021, so that businesses know that this will be the support as we move out of lockdown, and these are the taperings that we will expect to see around it. And that's been critical to making sure that other businesses in other European countries have not managed, have been able to plot a way forward and have not had the same stop-start experiences as businesses in the UK have experienced. And it's also fair to say that businesses don't want to rely on support forever. You know, the minister is correct, they have received a huge amount of support, and that's something that needs to be recognised. But they don't want to rely on it forever, but they do need to know what is reasonable support going forward for the whole of the year before they reopen operations. And last but not least, as we look to what needs to be supporting business, small and medium-sized businesses as we come over to growth, it's addressing this debt problem. Many businesses are not only seeing their cash flow really strapped and at the least that they've ever experienced, or if not any at all, but they're also ladled with debt. And so any intervention now needs to be without adding to debt. It needs to be in addition to that, but also we need to have strong and credible suggestions for reducing that debt over a longer period of time. And finally, I think it's fair to say that we'd really like to hold off any suggestion of tax rises on businesses until businesses have actually recovered. They've had two huge shocks, the COVID pandemic and then a trading conditions around the Brexit transition. We need to make sure that they recover fully before they're then hit with tax rises. And the focus of those tax rises should be on output taxes rather than the cost of setting up and running businesses, because that's when you're going to really stymie economic support and economic growth and all the things that we want to see from small and medium-sized businesses. And if the cost of setting up businesses is too high and the cost of employing people is too high, then you won't see the growth that we want to see to rebuild ourselves out of the economy. So very happy to be here, happy to ask questions going forward, answer questions going forward, but a clear message is that business support can't end as we come out of lockdown. We have to take a longer term view.
Thank you, Claire. I'll answer on John's behalf whether or not there's any chance of moving the budget date with a pretty simple, as unlikely, but if you don't ask, you don't get, I suppose. Look, very stimulating, thought-provoking, thank you. One of the things which I think has been a sort of common theme is around this idea of tech adoption, and whether we like it or not, over the last 12 months, businesses have had to adopt tech one way or another, whether that's in terms of their business performance, whether it's in terms of their day-to-day activity. So yeah, some of that is happening already. I suppose the question is what the next stage is. What is it that sort of goes beyond what we've all had to do over the last 12 months and catapults British business and productivity going forward? And Gary, I think we're particularly interested in your perspective on what that looks like, what the next stages of adoption, and what it is, not so much that you think sort of government needs to do in that area, but what the business opportunity is which can be seized and will help generate growth and productivity enhancement in the future.
I think there are probably a couple of aspects to that. And if you look relatively in terms of technology adoption among the European community, at least, the UK, the last study I saw placed the UK kind of mid-table in the digital intensity index. And so the good news is we weren't at the bottom of the table, but we certainly weren't at the top. And I think that the work that has been happening and the transition that has been happening over the last 10 or 15 or longer period of time has certainly been accelerated by the pandemic. We've seen, and probably all know, countless stories of small retailers that had to close their doors and have then pivoted to running e-commerce, and discovering that actually inside their existing business operations, there was latent capacity, there was an opportunity for them to address markets either outside of their geographic region using technology, or just address their customer demand digitally or using click and collect. And they've had to do that in the pandemic, but I think some of that will continue. And clearly we would like to see more encouragement of that, because that will drive significant improvements in efficiency. It will also drive productivity, and it will drive GVA in terms of a much more successful small business community harnessing technology. And I think the UK has possibly got quite a bit of work to do there. We see other regions around the world, and for example, in Australia right now, there are incentives in place and vouchers in place to encourage small businesses in particular to adopt technology. And so I think it's a bit of an open goal. Nobody would argue that driving technology adoption among small businesses will be good for the overall economy, but I think we have a lot to do there to really broaden awareness, help small businesses make the right choices and get the right help. And so it is a big challenge.
Thanks, Kerry. I'm going to go straight to questions in the audience, because I want to get as many of them in as possible. And the first question has come in from Matthew Elliott, who's a senior political advisor at Shore Capital and known to some of you, I'm sure. And Matthew asks what more banks can do to help SMEs as part of this economic recovery. And John, you made an interesting point about the support schemes that are in place for bank lending, but again, that sort of government helping banks to do some of that hard work. I wonder if you think that there is more that banks could and should be doing to help the SME community in the months and years to come.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, that was a very interesting discussion. I think that the issue, though, with banks is about customised support. I think the different panelists have made the case for different parts of the economy, but what's required is flexibility to recognise that in different businesses they'll need support to find bespoke solutions. I mean, Gary made the case for professional services and technology assisting professional services firms to advise businesses, but what banks need to be able to do is actually look at a business plan and say, well, how are we going to get the degree of working capital necessary to get this business going again? What will that take? And that will need sometimes investment in new technology or new ways of doing business. I mean, what this awful COVID experience has shown is that the opportunities of digital transformation for businesses are quite significant, and that will need investment. And for some larger SMEs, that will be re-looking at how that they refinance their business, and that will be a question of actually looking, creatively on first principles of what that means in terms of debt and equity and how that is looked at. So I'm looking to the banks, and I've been having a number of one-to-one conversations with CEOs of banks as they sort of prepare for this next phase. And then obviously what we're government are trying to do is provide the right framework of support to encourage that lending in a way that shares some of the risks at this time.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Yeah, and I think there's also an interesting question about the insurance industry, particularly off the back of that Supreme Court judgment, but more generally how they operate. Do you want to come on, John?
Yeah, just briefly on that. I mean, I think business interruption insurance was. It's a contractual obligation. I mean, the clarification from that court case is welcome, but what I think we've got to do is actually look at what we're insuring for and what we're not insuring for, and actually reset that relationship, because clearly there was a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity over where those boundaries lay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Claire, I'm going to come to you with a question that's coming from Tim Wallace. It's actually directed at John, but I think given proximity to budget, and I know the straight back answer we'll get from John, so I'm going to put it to you instead, Claire. And Tim asks about the sorts of interventions which could really help SMEs hire more workers. Tim sort of says, would this be about hiring subsidies, lower national insurance, other tax breaks, or something else entirely? What, in your view, and from the conversations you've had, would really help small businesses employ more people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really great question. So there's two areas that we've been calling on the Treasury and have formed part of our Treasury submission. The first one is reducing national insurance, so that is obviously a reduction in terms of cost for employers. The other is around an employment allowance and increasing the threshold for that, again reducing the cost of employment. So those two things going together could mean that it's much easier for people to keep workforce on. And as we all know, this is where, when the furlough scheme ends, and that's been a hugely generous scheme, and lots of credit due to John and his team, and we've worked really hard with them to introduce things like flexi furlough, which has been hugely successful about retaining jobs. We need to think, how do we long term keep the cost of employment low? So those are two interventions that we've called repeatedly for.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Claire. Eliza, a question for you from Nico McDonald, who asks really about what we can learn from the last 2 decades worth of experience within the creative sector in particular. What have we seen that have created those conditions for growth over the last 20 years, and how can we use that as a basis for growth in the future?
Such a good question. I think there's lots of things that I could say have created the growth, and some things that are still harming it. I think certainly different sort of investment in clusters across the UK. And going back to the question which John responded to, it's worth repeating that we're still finding that businesses outside of large clusters, and particularly outside of London, struggle to find access to finance. They tell us they struggle to find access to finance, even though increasingly they're operating in exactly the same way because they're both operating online. But I think that, investment across the UK has certainly paid off. Some very significant investment, of course, the BBC in Salford have been particularly effective, I would argue, but also tax reliefs. So thinking about how we actually play on an international field in terms of how we support our film industries, our game industries, those have really paid dividends for the sector as well. So there's just a couple of the ways I'd point to.
Thanks, Eliza. Gary, question for you. Ronald Layman's asked whether the panel, but I'm going to put this directly to you, Gary, agree with Killick and co that some SMEs operating now constitute the sandwich generation, those who survived the financial crisis of 2008, and were therefore better prepared for the challenges of coronavirus. You're obviously seeing business landscape right across the piece. Is that a reading of the situation that strikes a chord with you?
I think I probably would agree with that. I might throw in the fact that, if you can take the scenario of a pandemic and play it 20 years ago, what would the effects have been on our economy? Because I think partly because of the resilience that sandwich generation might have experienced, having been around for at least 10 years. But again, the role that technology, how do you pivot a business without technology? How do you find those other channels to market? And so I think I would agree with that. I think there's a recurring theme here which is coming along, and that's really the capital required, and whether the banks are providing the kind of capital to invest. And I think there's an important mindset shift that needs to occur here. And I think it's exemplified by what's frankly been incredible resilience among the small business community, not least helped by government support packages, but those businesses are still here. And that is lending not for survival and not to keep the lights on and to kind of get through the pandemic, but really lending for growth and changing the mindset of businesses to be more ambitious, more adventurous, and building better business cases for capital provision, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and particularly as we're striking out on our own outside of the European Union. I think I'd love to see more bank funding growth in businesses. And I think there's an important transition that we have to go through from survival and keeping the lights on and keeping our people on the payroll. But how do we really propel growth in the next decade? We think technology is a big part of that, but definitely capital. But I think it's mindset. I think growth mindset, not just survival.
Thanks, Gary. In a second, I'm going to ask Philip Burat to come on with his video, but I'm just giving him forewarning just in case he needs it. But before that, I've just got a question from Lauren McKevitt, which I think is best answered by one of Eliza or Claire, both of whom talked about skill shortages. And the question is around the rules at tax at the moment don't allow businesses to support personnel through masters programs without it being taxed as a benefit in kind, which seems strange if we're trying to upskill the British workforce. I was just wondering if that was something which either of you have thought about, trying to get more people through MAs and MSCs, and if you think we should be removing this anomaly from the tax system. Eliza, we're getting a little nod from you. So
I would actually make it a broader point, which is that I think that the skills system in general has been built for larger businesses, and we're seeing that all the time. So almost any element of the skills system that you break down is about, for example, placement. So T-levels, an amazing initiative, but requiring huge numbers of placements. The apprenticeship levy also requiring large amounts of commitment, and in general working for larger businesses. And so small businesses that have a large turnover are going to be penalised. There's lots of ways in which I think the skill system as a whole, including the way it was outlined, really only works for large businesses. And in terms of the apprenticeship levy, I think there's been tweaks made very recently, which have been incredibly welcome. But I think it really will take thinking about the entire system from the perspective of a small business, rather than always making those sort of individual tweaks so that it works a little bit better for one sector, small businesses in one sector or another.
Thanks, Eliza. Claire, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, yeah, I mean, really great point. Couple of things. So first of all, I look back to the heady days when small businesses spent all their time moaning with me about the apprenticeship levy, because that was the time before COVID, and so therefore I think it was a glorious period. But there has been a real focus on this from the government. You know, the government's FE white paper came out recently that does put business representatives organisations, including chambers of commerce, as part of developing skills programs in local areas, and that's massively welcome. But there's lots of things that the Treasury can do to facilitate that and make it easier for small and medium-sized businesses. For example, expanding the investment allowance to include training, for example, would be a great place to start, and thinking about how you potentially incentivise training in a place where actually there's lots and lots of candidates, but not necessarily the ones with the right skills. And that's a very different skills challenge than we've had in this country before. So something that really needs some thought about it. And then last but not least, I guess my thought around skills is that it falls between lots of different departments, and actually the Department for Education, Treasury, DWP, BEIS all have a role, and it doesn't feel particularly cohesive. And what we need to do is use the opportunity of the FE white paper to bring that all together.
Thank you, Claire. Philip, hopefully that fair warning has got you in a position where you're ready to join us on video.
Yeah, I think I've pressed the right. I think I've pressed the right buttons. Can you hear me, Nick?
We can.
Okay, thank you. This is a message for the Minister. John, thank you for joining us. I do apologise, I missed the first 20 minutes of this meeting. So if you've already said something, please just shoot me back down and said, I already said that. Two of the callers' questions are very close to what I'm talking about. I work for a company called JCB. We make diggers. Luckily, we're an essential industry, and I'd like to say the government has given us great and excellent support. However, like everybody else, we were staring down the abyss really in April while we couldn't get our factories restarted. And we're now looking at a very pleasant looking V-shaped recovery. The demand is there. We have lots of problems with our supply chains, not only around the world with shipping problems, but also some of our UK supply chains. And there was one product which the Chancellor described as niche, and that was the support scheme guaranteed credit insurance trading limits. This was really, really useful for us because we could really keep those credit limits moving. You'd, as a government, put it through till, I think you guaranteed them to the end of December at one point. You then extended that credit limit guarantee up to the end of June. Now, we've got accelerated sales at the moment. We've got a very buoyant order book. We're struggling, as I said, with our supply chains, but we're getting there. But this is about to end on the 30th of June 2021. Now, we need fair notice of this, which we've got. That's 4 or 5 months away. But to sustain this recovery, I think we need to have this tapered down. Quite happy about it being tapered, but to come off that cliff edge on the 30th of June is going to cause a problem. Now, the other areas concerned is...
Sorry, I'm slightly mindful we don't have long till the end of the hour. Would it be okay if I just put that question about that specific cliff edge?
Yeah, yes, of course. The other one was just capitalisation of banks isn't like it was in 2008. It's much better.
Marvellous. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, so I was involved in the decisions around that when it came in. We looked at what happened in the previous crisis, and we came up with the support for the backing for the trade credit insurance, and we're looking at the options going forward. I recognise the sensitivity around the end of it, and obviously tapering is one option, but those are matters that we're considering at the moment, and you wouldn't expect me to make announcements on a CPS webinar, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Always good to have the opportunity, John, just in case you feel tempted. Question from Sir John Redwood. Sir John, thank you very much for joining us again, twice in a week. Good to see you. John, this puts a question to you, Gary, says that you and your business obviously very successful at accounting and technology applications, and ask your opinion on what tax simplifications or cuts could do most good to promote self-employment and small businesses.
I think I'll try and be brief because I'm conscious of time. I think increasing R&D tax credits, and I think review the definition of that to include digital tools, as I mentioned earlier. I think there's scope to allow small firms to write off their digital tech investments. So if we're encouraging them to move online and to kind of pivot and build up those, then we should allow them to write some of that cost off. I think I would be arguing that reducing corporation tax for small firms is probably a sensible idea, and increase the annual investment allowance for small firms. And so there are a number of things, some of which are already in place to some extent, but we think there's a lot more that could be done to really kind of fund. I'm frankly incredibly optimistic about what the next period looks like, and this is a great opportunity to kind of set that small business economy up for success. And so anything and everything I think would be very beneficial.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gary. Question from Kenny Kemp, which I can't resist asking, not least because it gives kudos to your business, Gary. But I'm going to put the question to Eliza. And Kenny is a creative micro SME approaching his 20th year in business, survived the global banking collapse, and is a Xero user. And thanks you, Gary, for your product. But his question is about how we can increase the level of bespoke business training for fledgling companies. And I suppose, Eliza, you could put that specifically in the context of creative companies like Kenny's.
Yeah, that's a great question, and lots of layers to that, because there are already lots of policies which are thinking about how you can provide different types of training to companies like that. And I think that actually it goes back to the subject of this panel, which is that in general, small businesses have been missing from those conversations, and therefore actually a number of different policies haven't been fit for purpose. But certainly in terms of kind of levelling up investments, different kinds of skills hubs, there are all sorts of ways in which I think we can request the government provide specific, especially digital skills actually, for creative businesses. But I would go back to my second point when I was speaking about the kind of opportunities. I think going at the other end, there's also a huge open door to provide absolute cutting edge technological skills to creative companies in areas like artificial intelligence, which really could provide some of those productivity boosts that we're looking for in a sector that's mostly a service sector. So I think we need to look at both sides. We can absolutely make sure that the government's sort of digital skills hubs are fit for purpose, but then we also need to be thinking about really ambitious skills training in areas like AI for the sector too.
Thanks, Liza. John, question from John Moulton, who asked specifically around the insolvency rules that exist at the moment. And the insolvency rules in this country, as you all know better than me, are aimed at securing business survival rather than necessarily job survival. And he just questions whether there's a need for us to move away from preserving entities to trying to preserve jobs instead. Is that something that you recognise as an opportunity?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we face at the moment is trying to work out what interventions we needed to make as a sort of a short-term investment at a time of real challenge to keep businesses going, versus what is actually the transition versus what is actually the optimal state in a recovered environment. And so I do recognise the issue that he raises, and it's outside my direct policy area, but I've certainly been involved in conversations looking at that. And I think that's what we've got to have, and we've got to get this right in terms of the roadmap and the budget together. Actually, also recognising that we'll have to make another set of interventions when we get into the autumn. And there's a lot of speculation, which I'm not going to enter into in terms of the tax position. But what we've really got to do is do everything we can to create the conditions for recovery, and then look at actually what's the right place to be in terms of these rules and how we actually create the framework. And there's lots of really useful ideas in this conversation this afternoon that I will take on board.
Thanks, John. Claire, final question for you, and then I'll just ask if there's any final comments after that. But question for you, Claire, comes from Christopher Parr, and you talked about the debt that's been acquired by different businesses, and Christopher asks specifically whether all COVID debt should be capitalised. I know there's been quite a lot of work going on about the recapitalisation of this debt, and I wonder if you think that is part of the solution, and if you have sympathy with that idea that all debt is capitalised.
I mean, I certainly think, I don't know about all debt, but I certainly think capitalisation has to be part of it. It just has to be part of the way that we move forward. And, I know there's been some really good reports looking at how this would look like. There's also loads of innovative ideas about how you could reduce the debt burden. But, the debt burden possibly might kill the recovery, I think possibly is the way that many of our businesses talk to us. So I think it's an option, and certainly something we're very interested in.
Great, thank you, Claire. Just going to ask everybody for one sort of final thought about what could really make a difference to turbocharge SMEs in terms of driving this recovery. I'll start with you, Gary, then come Eliza and Claire. Before I ask John to make any final comments, I won't ask him to point out one thing unless he really wants to. Let's try to not make this about what will happen in the budget in 2 weeks' time, but what do we really think will lead to long-term change in the months and years to come? Gary.
I think that hundreds of thousands of SMEs have discovered new possibilities in their business as a result of the horrendous conditions being found in the pandemic, and will take what they've discovered and what they've learned about what their business could do into the future. And the more that we can do to support them, the better the economy will be. They make such a huge contribution, both in terms of jobs as well as GVA and GDP contribution. The more we can do to support them, the better.
Fantastic, thank you. Eliza?
Yeah, I'd echo the kind of quiet note of positivity that's run through some of the comments, which is that we see the demand is still there for many of these businesses. So I think what we should focus on is support for innovation, as I've already outlined, in its broadest possible definition, and then making sure that the whole raft of policies we've discussed are actually looked at from the SME lens as they're developed. So that means immigration policy, that means trade policy, and that especially means skill policy and levelling up policy. So designing it, thinking about the opportunity from small businesses rather than kind of easy option of working with the largest players in the room.
Great, thank you. Claire?
To build on Eliza's point, the bit small and medium-sized businesses will only succeed if they have the people with the right skills in order to drive that forward. And we're in a situation now where there will need to be a huge landscape in change in the way that we recruit and get skills in, how we train people, but also how we ensure that we don't have a generation that's left behind because they've had a really disruptive skills, apprenticeships, schools and university system. So we've got to get that right. Otherwise, we don't stand a chance with anything else.
Yeah, tough time to be young. John, some final thoughts from you, please.
Yes, having grown up in a small business, worked in as a business advisor and invested in small businesses, what is really clear is that government can't run businesses. Government can provide the framework and the support for investment and the encouragement for businesses to look at what it means to be productive, to invest in new technology and skills and innovation, to actually get to a point where Gary's clearly been, where you've seen something grow from nothing to a significant enterprise. And what I'm focused on as a city minister is helping ensure that the financial infrastructure, the banking and financial institutions are given the best sort of support from government to enable them to do their role, which is actually to provide the finance for that. But I recognise that across the conversation, and many of the things that Eliza said in particular, are useful ideas to actually feed into specific sectors. Obviously, there's a whole framework of interventions through Innovate UK, through the massive step change in research that we've had. I take the point about it needing to be focused on SMEs and their voice needing to be heard in this conversation. But actually what we need to do is empower SMEs to take bold decisions for a sustained recovery.
Thank you, John. Positive note on which to end. Thank you so much to all the panelists for taking part. Thank you to everybody who has joined in. Sorry that I didn't get to everybody's questions. There were lots of them, as you might expect. Particular thanks to Gary and Xero for supporting this. But other than that, all remains to say goodbye in the traditional Zoom fashion, waving at a screen slightly mindlessly. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much.